Today we're going to build a chair. I call it the simple chair because we're going to use 2x4 construction. Standard height is 23 inches. It will be 28 inches towards the back. It'll have a 5-degree slant on the seat, and it'll have a 15-degree slant on the back. Simple enough construction, as again 2x4s, and we're going to use simple joinery. This will live under the lanai, but we will stain it, and it won't see too much weather, so we won't use pressure treat it. We're just using common 2x4s. First thing to do is cut all the lengths.
I'm going to start by trimming off the end of the 2x4 to make sure it's good and square. Now there's only 4 different lengths here. I'll set the stop at the various sections and go ahead and make all those cuts. Once I had everything cut to length, I took 2 of the 2x4s and ripped them in half. These will make up the seat support and the back support. Here I start cutting the slats. There's 22 of them overall. I wanted to get at least 3 out of each length of 2x4. This means that each of the slats is a little over an inch wide. Once I had all the slats cut, I came over to the router table where I had a roundover bit set up, and I'm just easing the edges on the top of the slats. I have my stacked dado head cutter set to a 1/2 inch height, and now I'm just going to take the ends off of the legs. That way I can mortise them into the armrests and create a really good joint. I do the face of the leg first and then the sides. You'll notice that there's a small block on the fence, and that just keeps me at a fixed distance without having the end of the board hitting the fence as I go over. That can cause it to bind, and that could create a nasty situation on the blade itself. I then take a rasp and smooth out some of those edges because the stacked dado head cutter didn't do that great a job on those faces. Now here I've switched to the auxiliary fence on my miter gauge, and what I'm doing here is prepping for those cuts on the armrests. Just using a scrap piece of wood to get the right sizing. And what's going to end up happening is I'm going to work my way into it. I've got some lines drawn, and I'm just trying to gauge the right size. It took me about 3 passes to get it just right, and then I set up some stops so that I can get all of the armrests taken care of nice and neat. And here you can see really nice tight joint. With everything cut on the armrests, I wanted to round over those corners, and you may have seen my video where I made this handy little sander. It's just the 4 pieces or the 4 corners of the armrest. Get some sanding here, and later I'll take care of it with some 100 grit paper. Here I'm pre-drilling for the holes that will hold the legs onto the armrest. There are 4 on each side. I've set the depth stop on my drill press so that I get a consistent hole, and I marked everything off. Now what I did is I took some scrap pieces of plywood and created a jig for spacing, and I went ahead and did all the drilling on all of the slats so it's consistent, so that when you're looking at the piece you can see all the screw holes are all lined up. And now we get to most woodworkers' favorite part, the sanding. I sanded all the pieces with 100 grit sandpaper. I didn't want to go to anything finer, like a 150 or 220, because I wanted the piece to be a bit rustic and it's going to sit outside. Along with the tops, I also have to do the ends. If you want the stain to look even, it's a rule of thumb that you should go 1 step higher on your sandpaper for the end grain. Here I left it at 100 grit, and that way the ends are really dark and makes a nice contrast when you're looking at the side of the chair. Having done one side, I have to go and do the other. Now we're going to do some assembly on the legs. Later I'm going to have to sand the tops to make sure everything is nice and smooth. But here you're just seeing me apply glue to the leg surfaces, those mortises and tenons that I cut earlier. Spread everything with my brush, and should be a pretty good fit. We test fit everything before. And then I just use some construction screws to get everything in place. But I always like to check for square. I have found that if you don't do that, your chair will wobble a lot. I usually set one screw first and then check the square again to make sure that we're still in good shape. I can still rotate around that single screw. And onto the other leg, same treatment. Now, one of the things that's important here is we're going to have a little bit of the glue come out. It's important to clean that up, because if you don't, the stain won't really adhere well. You'll actually see the glue lines. So right after this shot, I went ahead and took a damp rag and cleaned everything up. Now I'm going to move on to setting the base for the actual seat, the lower part. I have to offset the height for the thickness of the slats. The top of those slats have to be at 15.5 inches, so all I'm doing here is just marking off those spaces. That square I've set has an offset on it, and I'm setting this piece at 5 degrees. That way when I build the back on it at 10 degrees, I'll have an overall 15 degree for the back. And now I'm just prepping for some screw holes that I will set. I'm going to put 2 screws on each of the legs, and like before, I'm just using my countersink to set in the construction screws. Nothing fancy here, no need for glue. These screws will more than adequately hold up the bottom of the chair. And here I've just flipped over and done the other side. Now we got to set the back. Similarly, I'm going to use one of the slats to measure the offset and mark where the back goes. And then I'm going to go over to my miter saw and cut a 10-degree angle. I've reset the square to 10 degrees, and I'm just going to set a spacer block here. It's more like a stop to make sure the piece doesn't move away from us. Pre-drill the bottom and use one of the screws to hold the base of that back onto the actual seat. One screw will be more than enough. There's really very little pressure that you put on this. And I'll end up putting 2 screws on the back to this back leg. And it's starting to look like a chair. From here, it's a little bit of assembly. I went ahead and grabbed some of the slats and wanted to hold the piece up, because I'm going to stain this and I didn't want to leave it lying flat on one of the benches. So I'm just going to set up 2 of the slats, one at the very top of the back and one at the very front of the seat. Each slat gets a single screw, and it'll hold everything up right, so that when I go ahead and stain, like I said before, the piece stands on its own. Stain the bottom first using some chestnut stain, again, not outdoor stain, some indoor variety. I make sure to stain the tips of the legs themselves. Get plenty of stain in there to penetrate, because even though it's going to be in a covered lanai, it may get wet, and we don't want the moisture wicking up. You notice in the background I got a fan going. It is summer in Florida and always need some ventilation. Now I brought the chair over onto the floor and just work my way around it, make sure all the surfaces are covered. I could have done this on one of the benches, but then it would have been tough to get to the back of the chair. And now I start with the slats, all 22 of them. I actually cut more than that. I cut about 26 slats just to be sure. Wouldn't want to have to stop what I'm doing because a slat broke or a screw snapped. I started doing one at a time and then realized I can gang them together. Everything stained and set to dry overnight. And now the fun part. I go ahead and just install the slats. I used a single slat as a spacer to get everything even. And you see I put this little board on the end that makes sure that the pieces are all set to the right distance and not floating around. I also used the time-lapse feature on my phone. It worked pretty well. And here's the test. Nice firm seat. Comfortable. I'll eventually put some cushions on this, but as you can see, an excellent chair. Great for sitting out by the lanai and enjoying a drink. Join us next time on Rick's Woodworking to see what else we'll build. Maybe a table or a footrest.